Welcome to another and a very special episode of Talking Books on Talking Feds. Many of our Talking Books episodes are, we hope, valuable accounts and analyses of current events. Much less frequently are they breakthrough ideas in human behavior. I'm really thrilled to welcome today Danny Kahneman. He is one of the most important thinkers of our time and a Promethean explorer of human irrationality and its vast effects on our decisions and our lives. He is the Eugene Higgins Professor of Psychology at Princeton and Professor of Public Affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He won the 2000 Nobel Prize in Economics. Let me repeat that. He won the 2000 Nobel Prize in Economics, and he is not an economist, and the National Medal of Freedom in 2013, among many other awards. He's the author of New York Times bestseller Thinking Fast and Slow, which is is chock full of very important ideas, summarizing much of his research to date. But he's now followed it up with the book Noise, which he's co-written with Oliver Saboni and Cass Sunstein. Really thrilled to welcome you to Talking Books, Danny Kahneman.
My pleasure.
I'd like to begin, if you don't mind, with a short story that is set in 2002 at the Wilson School. I was there for a few years, and I had just arrived that day and was exploring an essential perk of professordom there, which is the espresso machine down at the end by the kitchen. And I couldn't figure out how the contraption worked. And a very nice, kind man came by and just saw me fumbling, and in his kindness just sort of showed me everything, how it would work. And I had my espresso. And the next day, he won the Nobel Prize. So it really is an illustration of that the world rewards random acts of kindness. And thank you for keeping me in espresso during my days at Princeton, Danny. I expect you don't remember that, but of course I do. All right. The book, Noise. I'd like to begin with a question I'm sure you field in every one of these interviews, but what is noise?
Well, noise is unwanted variability in judgments that should be identical. It's when the same person judges the same object on multiple occasions and doesn't agree with himself or herself, that's noise. And when people make judgments of the same objects, if they don't agree with each other when they should, that's noise.
And you give many examples from apparently objective judgments like fingerprints to things we know that are subjective but have no clue that they vary. There's unwanted and unpredicted variability, say an adjuster deciding what a claim is worth or judges imposing sentence. We'll talk about it much more, but it's been, your work to date has been about bias, which is a very obvious source of human irrationality, but sometimes unknown to us. But this has been this feels like a new idea and a very important one for mistaken judgments, which are A, hugely costly, and B, much of what you've revealed to us. Why has noise, as opposed to bias, been hiding, in plain sight for so long?
Well, I'll take a couple of minutes to
Please
define the terms. We think of judgment as measurement. We're the instrument of measurement in the human mind. And in the theory of measurement, when you measure the same object multiple times, there are two kinds of errors that you can distinguish. There is bias, and that's when the average judgment is to one side or another of the truth. That's bias. Noise is simply the variability of judgments. And you can see that even in the complete absence of bias, if judgments are scattered around the true value, and if they're widely scattered, then those judgments are not accurate, or those measurements are not accurate. So that's bias and noise. And there's something else that we can get from the theory of noise, and that goes back to Friedrich Gauss. And, and it is that when you look at the total inaccuracy of a set of measurements, say, the total accuracy is equal to the square of the bias plus the square of the noise. And we don't need to go into the mathematics of this, but the point is that bias and noise are conceptually equivalent. They have the same weight as determinants of inaccuracy, but that's clearly not the way that people see them. We constantly think of bias, and noise, as you mentioned, is widely ignored.
Yeah, and we'll maybe talk about that more. That is a basic statistical um, principle that drives. I want to. I at first was confused when I read that. So you're not suggesting that bias and noise are necessarily equal in their contribution to any set of errors, but just in the Gaussian. Well, actually, is there a way to sort of give the Gaussian the basic principle in more layperson's terms?
Well, it's just that you have those two families of errors, and they're distinctly different. One of them is the average of an error. So if you're measuring length in centimeters, bias is measured in centimeters. The other one is the variability of errors. It's the dispersion, and it's really completely different. And the point of that formula, and I don't want to repeat any mathematics
Yep.
here, the point of that formula is that in principle, bias and noise are equivalent. And that's sort of important. In practice, I think there is a lot more noise than error in judgments, and that
Yeah.
noise is a more significant source of inaccuracy in many cases than
Then by
biases.
and this is a big headline, by the way, if that's true, because so much of your work to date has explored bias, and not simply bias of, the most crass kind, say I'm biased against certain people, but biases that we have kind of, hardwired. For example, a bias to think that everything what you see is all there is, as you've put it, or other predictable kinds of errors by humans. At this point, by the way, and maybe before, we'll post a very simple graphic that you begin with that does make this a lot clearer. And it's of a target, and you can imagine several shots around a target by one person or by many people. And imagine one where it's pretty widely scattered, and yet the kind of mean, if you will, and that's simplifying a statistical term, is at the bullseye, but each of them is pretty far off. And that would be noise. And you, in some ways of looking at things, people would say, oh, it's roughly all about correct if you put it all together. But in fact, what you have is a collection of completely mistaken judgments. And then bias in this way of thinking would be represented by a scale, whether that's consistently, say, to the left or the right of the bullseye. And that brings it home, and we're posting that, but we can talk about it much more concretely and less, because it's amazing, and this comes out through in some of the reviews, including with your co-authors. Once you put on the noise lens, you see it everywhere. As I think Cass Sunstein put it, you have a complete. Oh, I'm sorry. What is the way he said? There are experiments everywhere. No, the term is um, uh, in any event, noise everywhere. And let's just think of one example. So decisions that seem, objective and unvariable, like fingerprints, but other very Ones we think are fairly loose, but we don't think about the noise. Let me give an example that many people would have. You have a meeting, and everybody talks through things together, and then they reach what people regard as a consensus, and they all feel pretty good about. And yet, you would posit it's quite possible they've arrived together at a flawed judgment because of noise. Yes, and how might that work in practice?
Well, in practice, I mean, what we would say is that the very process of discussing something, of discussing the joint a judgment, it artificially reduces the variability because people very quickly converge to a judgment. And that's a remarkable process, the process by which we adjust our thinking to fit with the thinking of others. So if you want to see noise in the judgment of, say, how much an investment is worth, then don't wait and listen to the discussion, but before the discussion, have every one of the participants indicate how much that investment is worth, independently and without talking about it with anyone else. And that's where we call that a noise audit. And in a noise audit, you are going to see a lot of noise. And I can almost guarantee it, more noise than you expect. So, we have a slogan that we say, wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and there is more of it than you think. Um, I think the example that started us may be worth bringing in, and that's the example of the insurance company. That really is where I became interested in the problem. And I was working with underwriters and with claims adjusters. And underwriters and claims adjusters make numerical judgments about risks or about claims. And you can look at underwriters looking at a particular problem and putting a dollar value on it. Now, an underwriter doesn't speak for himself or herself. An underwriter speaks for the company. And you would expect the company to speak in one voice. But we ran an experiment where we presented, say, 50 underwriters with the same problem, a very realistic problem, and we asked them to put a dollar value on that risk. And we also asked the executives a question that I invite any listener to think about as well. If you take two underwriters at random, by how much do you expect them to differ in percentages? And people have an answer to this. And the answer is quite odd where there should be. It's about 10%. 10% feels like a reasonable amount of disagreement between people. But in fact, when we measured exactly that quantity, we looked at all possible pairs of underwriters and we computed the average difference. It was 50%, 50, 5 times larger than the executives had expected. So that's where the book began, because there was a huge amount of noise, and people in the insurance company did not know that they had that problem. And that's what made it interesting.
And these are experts, I should underscore. And a similar example, also an important one in the book, may be more familiar to listeners in a legal podcast, sentencing. So the whole effort to try to bring consistency to sentencing, which Justice Breyer did when he was in Congress, came about because if you do a large scale study, you'll find there's possibility of bias, as I've said, but if you would be very surprised to see the numbers of the way judges vary on the same kind of defendant, very dramatic, not marginal, and even the same judge. This is a kind of noise as well, could vary one day from the next in how he or she would sentence a person. And since many of these judgments are one off, it's kind of cloaked to our view. Let me return, in fact, to that meeting, just because people attend meetings a lot, and it unrolls in real time. You reach a consensus, but what you don't realize, if you did it 100 times or the equivalent, you would likely come out with wildly different answers just based on the vagaries of who spoke first or how confident they appeared, and the bottom line sense of agreement and consensus is sort of illusory. And I did specifically because you didn't do what Danny you're just talking about now, figuring it out in advance, but everyone gets together and talks and thinks they've come toward the truth, and it's more often than not a fallacy. Yeah.
Yeah, because the procedure of having a discussion is open to chance variability. As you say, who speaks first has a great deal of influence on the outcome. So even group decisions are noisy. They would be less noisy if you ran a noise audit and you explored the actual variability of opinions that exist, and then you try to reach consensus by discussing the differences of the opinion. But the process of discussion frequently masks the amount of disagreement that exists in a group. And that can be enough.
Yeah, there's another example I think maybe a lot of people have heard of. Supposedly, this Columbia University professor every year asks his class to predict the winners of the Oscars, and they find that the composite is more accurate, perhaps, than any of the individual ones. But this, I think, shows it kind of precisely, because each person there has to make his or her own judgment and in a sort of closed ballot without consulting the others. If by contrast there was an overall discussion and a blackboard and arrived at those names, presumably the accuracy would be a much more noisy decision. Would that be a fair way to put
That,
it?
that is absolutely correct. And by the way, uh, I'll interject something here
Yeah.
because the process that you mentioned, that averaging or pooling the judgments of a large number of people, is widely known as the wisdom of the crowd.
Yeah.
A well-known book was written about this some 20 years ago. Now, I want to point out that the wisdom of the crowd actually eliminates noise. It doesn't do anything to bias. So if people, for example, are estimating, the classic example is the weight of an ox, because that's the first time experiment that was done on it. And in that particular case, the average judgment was very, very close, although there was a lot of variability. And it's statistically guaranteed that if you collect a lot of independent judgments, you're going to eliminate noise. But if there is an average error, that is, if people are biased as a group, then the bias is unaffected. The wisdom of the crowd eliminates noise. It does not eliminate bias. And that's a distinction that very few people, I think, are aware of.
Yeah, it's a great point. So all in all, it converges. Is it known? I mean, why is there wisdom of crowds? Why is it the case that it eliminates noise?
Well, it's it's because of the statistics of things. That is, if you take measurements, single instances of measurements, they have a certain variability. But now suppose that what you do is you take four individuals and you compute their average, and then you take four other individuals and you compute their average. The variability of the average of four judgments or four measurements is going to be one half of the variability of single judgment. So there is a statistical rule, and it's mechanical and it's completely predictable. The larger the sample that you average, the less noise there will be, the more stable your estimate is going to be. And that is because, in that sense, in that context, errors in some sense, cancel out. That is, it's not that they actually cancel out, but the error grows much more slowly than the truth. So what people have in common when they make a judgment, what they agree on, the truth that they agree on, that keeps building up. And the error builds up much more slowly, and the ratio of truth to error keeps improving. But this is true for variability, it's true for noise. It is not at all true for bias. So the fact that a lot of people agree on something doesn't mean that there is no bias.
Yeah. No, this a really nice way to put it. So it's not that there's some metaphysical quality when a lot of people get together. You could do if you could run the same experiment with an individual making a judgment, then somehow having his memory erased, an unbiased individual, and doing it 100 times, you would also be converging. It's a statistical principle, correct?
Yes.
Um, okay, now we've talked a lot about well, let me follow up just a little. In your work in Thinking Fast and Slow and your many of your experiments, you discuss the reasons for bias. There are um, discernible, at least in many cases, reasons. They may have to do with evolutionary accounts of why we think in certain ways or why it's advantageous sometimes to make a quick judgment when you think of our development. Is there a similar account of why there is noise, or is it really almost just a function like math, something that's in the world unavoidably and doesn't explain itself based on certain human qualities? Does that
Well,
question make sense?
it's an excellent question, and it's a very deep question. And it has,
Wow. Danny Kahneman said I told a deep question. I'm like,
and it,
okay. All right.
come on. Uh,
Go ahead.
and there is intrinsic variability in any biological process, so that your heart rate is actually not completely uniform. And when you sign checks twice in a row, your signatures are not going to be uniform. And so there is variability at the biological level. And it turns out that there are multiple sources of noise that can be identified. And I want to think of the example of sentencing because that's where you can see it most clearly.
Hmm.
So, one kind that you mentioned is that there is within judge variability, so that the same judge will not pass the same sentence when in a good mood or in a bad mood. When then there is variability in the bias of how severe or lenient judges are. And those are individual biases, except the different judges are biased to different degrees. And that creates noise at the level of the justice system. The justice system doesn't speak in one voice if different judges are going to make more or less severe judgments. But the most interesting source of noise is actually different. The most interesting source of noise is that different judges have different tastes. They have different tastes in defendants. They have different tastes in crimes, about crimes. That is, some judges are really horrified by violence and others are horrified when the victim is an elderly person. And those differences in what they mean is that if you had multiple judges passing sentences on the same crimes, they would not only differ that some judges are more severe than others, the crimes would not be ranked the same. That is, if you ordered the, the crimes or the cases from the most severe to the least severe, different judges would systematically be different in their ranking of cases. That we call pattern noise. And what it means is that when two people look at the same world, each of them is convinced that they see the world the way it is. And each of them is convinced that if the other is a reasonable person, they must see the world as I do. But in fact, they're wrong. In fact, people differ from each other in how they look at cases much, much more than they can imagine. And the reason they can't imagine it is that we all have that illusion, and each of us constructs a world that is somewhat different from the worlds that other people live in.
Leading to the result in sentencing that the average variability, which we can, the noisiness is far greater, I'm sure, than judges generally believe. You go into the different kinds of noises: pattern noise, stable noise, occasion noise. We don't have to detail them, but when you put them all together, judges, I think, would be astonished and horrified. And it's pretty interesting to note that the Supreme Court actually insisted on reinstating a very large level of individual discretion and judgment to sentencing judges after guidelines had come into play to try to reduce, certainly not eliminate. So, query whether the court understands just how noisy they've made the system. And to be clear, there's two reasons here that you really don't want noise. One is it departs from accuracy, but the other, and sentencing brings this home, is it's not fair. There's a real problem of equity in noise because it means people, in this case offenders, are not treated like, which seems a fundamental principle of justice. Yeah.
There is a lottery involved, and the defendant
That
takes
was
the
that was the
lottery.
Sunstein. There are lotteries everywhere. Pardon me. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
And the size of the lottery is so in an experiment on sentencing, where you have judges pass sentences on schematic cases, for a case where the average judgment was 7 years in prison, if you took two judges at random and you looked at the difference between them, it would be 4 years. And that's the extent of the lottery that the defendant would face. That seems to be scandalous. And at the same time, judges were absolutely opposed to deadlines and very much happier when the deadlines became advisory rather than obligatory. And and
And confident that in fact they didn't vary that much.
they don't even raise that question, I think.
Yeah.
They feel, at least there is a widespread feeling that justice flows through them. That is, that the
Yeah.
way that they feel the appropriate sentence, there is something that makes it right. Otherwise, they couldn't live with themselves. And it makes them very resistant, I think, to the idea of noise, much more than other professions. I mean, physicians are much easier from that point of view. I mean, they know that they vary. They don't know how much they vary, but they know that they vary.
A certain kind of physician, about as bad as anything it seems in the professional setting. That this is just a quick departure. Is psychiatric diagnoses, which are wildly varying, and perhaps psychiatrists recognize it, but hard to say. All right, so you've adverted to this a few times, Danny. So about a full half of the book or so is after laying out how not only what noise is, but how it is all around us. And listeners, I'm telling you, if you take this idea to heart for a couple weeks, you'll be seeing noise everywhere. But all right, so not only it's ubiquitous, but then having laid that out, you talk a lot about how to make the world and individual judgments less noisy, and a central concept here is decision hygiene. Could you explain what
Yeah.
that is and what it comprises?
Well, we came up with the term decision hygiene, and it's not an attractive term, and actually the choice is quite deliberate.
Yeah.
Uh, in the case of an illness, you can prevent an illness with vaccines. You can cure an illness with surgery or with medication. And vaccine, surgery, medication, they're very specific. That is, you have a problem and you solve that problem. This is true for bias. That's the way we try to deal with bias. We know what the illness is, and we try to remedy it. Noise is really a different animal. Noise, you don't know where it comes from. You cannot anticipate exactly what's going to happen when you're
Most people
facing
don't
noise.
even know it's there at all, in fact, yes.
You don't feel that it's there.
Yeah.
So what you need is not surgery, it's not medication, it's not vaccination, it's washing your hands. It's trying to adopt procedures that will kill germs, and you will never know what germs you killed if you wash your hands. And that's the image that we wanted to convey with the choice of that term, decision hygiene.
Gotcha. And it does have certain important concomitants. So, like, one is we've already talked about for the statistical principle that several judgments, the more the better, go toward. So you want to either by construct or actually have many different independent judgments. I think we've covered that, but the independence is important. Then there's also this notion of disaggregation. That maybe that is what I mean by independence. When I read it, I thought about. I'll take a step back and say, noise. It really is in some ways a revelation, scales falling from your eyes. But it's been, some people have thought about it or intuitively. The Philip Tetlock book from 2005 talks, I think, a lot about it. But I was thinking of the example. I'm a sports fan that boxing judges. I'm not sure if you know this principle, but they have to give their score for each round when that round ends, put it in the box and not see it again. Otherwise, by round 12, when the previous loser is rallies and beats the other person terribly, it would corrupt the previous decision. In a similar way, I think you counsel the importance of taking subcomponents of a decision one step at a time and segregating them out, even if you don't weigh. Well, let me shut up now. What how do you um counsel this, and what's the idea here?
Well, actually, in my personal history, this goes back a very long way. It goes back to when I was uh, a lieutenant in the Israeli army.
Yeah.
I was
I
21
mean, which
years
is when
old.
these basic. I let me just say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
your these ideas first came to you when you overhauled the psychological or your glimmerings of ideas, the whole psychological study and profile of the Israeli army for predictions about certain kinds of qualities of soldiers. Yes, well, so the practical stakes very high, almost existential. So
What what I designed at the time was a structured interview,
yeah.
and 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 there is now, I mean, I didn't invent the term. There is now thousands of studies of structured and unstructured interview. The unstructured interview is when people do what comes naturally. They want to evaluate a person, they talk with that person, and they try to form an impression. The structured interview is radically different. You break up what you want to learn about that person into dimensions or attributes, and you score it immediately, and then you go on to the next thing. And by the end, when you have a whole profile of the judgments of all the dimensions, that is when you're invited to have an intuition and to think globally. But you're delaying intuition, and you're trying to break up the problem into elements. Now, turns out that structured interviews are just better than unstructured interviews. They're more accurate. It's not as if they are very accurate because predicting job performance is extremely difficult, to some extent impossible. But to the extent that it's possible, structured interviews are much better. And what we did in this book is we propose a very simple idea that when you're facing a decision and you have multiple options, you can view each option as if it was a candidate. So that's another slogan we have. Options are like candidates. And then the equivalent of a structured interview is trying to break up the attributes of options that make them more or less desirable and trying to judge those independently of each other, sequentially, and without and delaying intuition until you have the whole picture. So that's the principal piece of advice that we have for people in terms of decision hygiene. And we think it will reduce noise and it will reduce bias.
And by the way, so this is another example, not just illustrated, but documented at length in the book, along with sentencing and adjuster um, error. It is the if the instincts that people have of how imprecise or varying judgments about job qualifications and who's going to be a good employee, a very important decision for any organization, are huge. They hugely underestimate. It's stunning the degree of variability. And you talk about, there are a lot of people who've been there a while who they're given certain scripts perhaps to follow, but they really do feel confident that they don't need them. They know what to do. They can take the measure of the man or woman quickly and really know. And they're if you can't say they're wrong, you probably can, but what you can say is they vary hugely more than they expect from not just other equally experienced people, but what if you could run the experiment, their own judgment would be on a different day or any of a different 1,000 days. All right, but let me zero in. So, in general, there you have a lot of prescriptions for different principles, but this is a big one. You take the different subcomponents, you break them up, but you do at the end. And this was intriguing to me. You do at the end say, okay, once you've done those things, now bring your intuition to bear. Now do that human thing that we've all sort of done. Looking at a menu in a restaurant, and your eyes scan down, and then just one dish, who knows why, just all of a sudden feels right, and you think the right decision. Of course, and in a parallel universe, you would choose another, and you don't realize it. But you say, Danny, that the optimal event of noise, and so this sort of intuition, you could say, is not zero. That is, you do insist on preserving the idea of a sort of final human intuition, notwithstanding having documented how errant and fallacious it can be before there's a lot of input in it. Why is that? Why, at the end of the day, do you think it's actually? Is it that it's unavoidable, or it really seems like you think it's preferable that at the end of the day you exercise your intuition?
To state it very precisely, we think that eliminating noise completely is costly.
Yeah.
It's bureaucratic. It makes
Is it
life
because
less
in the
interesting.
it just takes too long, among other things?
It takes long, but even if it doesn't take long, it is demoralizing for the people who are involved in it
Mm.
because they feel, as people in the Israeli army, the interviewers that I made, I forced them to use that structured interview. I still remember one of them saying, "You're turning us into robots." That is, they, interviewers, like judges, they like to experience it. They like to experience their subjectivity. And clearly, if you eliminate noise and you turn the whole thing into a bureaucratic exercise, this is costly. So it's not so much that a little noise is good, but that the cost of eliminating or reducing noise, eventually it's not worth it.
In demoralization, or people don't feel human anymore? Is that the basic
That's
cost?
that would be part of it, certainly.
Yeah.
And imposing, when people feel that it's not their judgment, that they're just filling in numbers, this is costly for one organization. So the act of reducing noise while keeping the workforce, the people who are making those judgments involved, keeping them involved and interested and not demoralized. That that is quite a trick, and we admit that it's very difficult. And we said it should better be done carefully.
Got it. So it's not as if once proper scaffolding is erected, that final dollop or of intuition is unnoisy, but just that it's desirable for different utilitarian reasons, I guess.
I think I mean, people need it to to feel satisfaction and confidence in what they're doing. People do need that sense of being right, um, of having done a good job on something. And to the extent that people are going to be involved in making judgments and decisions, you want them to feel good about what they do. I should mention that in many cases, you can replace people by algorithms or by simple rules
Right.
that will be completely noise free and that will, in many cases, perform better than people. But if you are using people,
Right.
you'd better accommodate to them.
It's like a psychological version of, 2001: A Space Odyssey, whatever you do at the end, want a world with people living in it. Although I did want to ask you about this concept. It also turns out that there are a few people in the world, you put them at, 1 or 2%, so-called super predictors who are light years better than most of us. Most of us have confidence that we are. Most of our views of how good we are hugely distorted. We're so much worse than we think, so much noisier than we think. But a couple percent of us are actually Ubermensch and this kind of thing. Who are they and why? Any
Well,
sense?
this is the work of Philip Tetlock. It's
Yeah.
very important work on super
Right.
forecasters. It's also a book that he wrote with Dan Gardner that
Is this
reads.
expert political judgment, the
No,
2005 book?
Expert Political Judgment is 2005.
Yeah.
This is called Super Forecasters, and I don't remember when it appeared,
Okay.
probably 2016 or 18, something like
Gotcha.
that. And and it reads like like a very good novel. It reads like a thriller. And what they find is that there is a small percentage of people. It's not that they do it absolutely right. They can't because the future is largely unpredictable, but they do better than other people and they do so consistently. And they do so in part because of who they are and in part because they are trained to do certain things. So
Ah.
they are numerically well informed people, but
Oh, they
especially
already know to wash their hands and all these things. Is that
that's it.
basically the idea?
They wash their hands. And uh, there is a characteristic that may be the most important, which is called active open mindedness. This is the attitude that people have that not to close themselves off. This is the big cost of having intuitions too early, is that once you have them, you're no longer interested in getting new information. Anything that happens, you interpret in light of the judgment you've already made. Super forecasters manage to remain open to new evidence. And that is very good advice for everybody, not only for super forecasters.
The book is Noise. There are a few super forecasters, but for the rest of us, we need to be aware of just how much noise is around. And I guarantee you, listeners, once if you take this idea to heart, you'll be seeing it everywhere. And you can read all about it. In this, it's now out with then. And again, in addition to Danny, his co-authors are Oliver Sibony and Cass Sunstein. Thank you so much, Danny, for spending time with us and explaining this important idea. It's been a really great discussion for me personally.
It was my pleasure.